So today we're going to talk a little bit about employee equity. We're going to talk about reservation of shares under a stock plan, which is basically the mode in which the company reserves shares for issuance to employees, reserve shares or employs different types of equity. So we're going to talk about how this stock plan is adopted and approved, how it's evidenced, some of the bells and whistles. We're going to talk about the size of the stock pool or the option pool. We're going to talk about who is eligible to receive stock in a corporation is under this plan, and we're going to talk about the types and a little bit more of the in-depth mechanics of the various equity considerations that come in. So, stock equity issued under a stock plan is issued to service providers. These can be a generic list of individuals such as employees, contractors, directors, advisors, management, other types of service providers. Granted, they are individuals that are actually providing bona fide services to the company. For instance, like an advisor that's helping a board make a decision. This doesn't normally include folks that are acting as a broker, perhaps, to help raise capital. That's one of the things you need to kind of avoid in the definition of service providers. So why does this stock plan matter? Well, the stock plan is a mechanism to comply with various securities and tax laws when it comes to the issuance of shares or equity to service providers under this plan. And it's so important because in an early stage company or in a startup, it's crucial with low cash flow to be able to obtain, retain, and incentivize talent. We're talking about technology companies. We're talking about companies that are going to need to hire developers, engineers, scientists, and all those folks can demand a hefty compensation package. And so one way to kind of compete for that talent, despite not having a ton of cash flow or a ton of cash on hand, is to offer equity incentives. And again, at this point in the company's life cycle where they're hiring and bringing folks on, they might not even have a large investment in the company yet, or they might be thinking about an investment in the company in the future. They're low on cash, but they want to offer this upside as a mechanism to compensate these individuals and to bring in talent. So one way that when we think about a stock plan, we're thinking about who can receive equity under these plans, those service providers. We're also thinking about how the stock plan is adopted. What do we have to do to have a stock plan? Well, it has to be in writing, and it has to be approved by the stockholders and the board of directors, saying this is our stock plan and this is how it works. It's going to include a lot of bells and whistles in there, and we're going to talk about some of the core aspects of the stock plan. One core aspect of the stock plan is the pool. How much of the shares are going to be reserved under the stock plan pool? For instance, we talked about authorized shares earlier. We've talked about that a company might have 10 million authorized shares. They might say, of this 10 million, we're going to reserve 500,000 to be designated and reserved for individuals to receive under the stock plan. So for instance, let's think about let's think about this in context. So if a company is hiring employees and bringing them on and giving them shares under the stock plan, they're probably thinking about funding their operations through investors. Investors are going to want the company to establish a stock plan before that investor invests. Why? Because those investors will be diluted when you issue more shares to employees. So they will want those shares to be reserved on the front end, so they're not diluted on the back end. Let's take an example here. So let's say, we have 10 million authorized shares, and Adam and Betty each own 1 million shares for a total of 2 million. They may reserve 500,000 shares to be awarded under the plan. This is the option pool. The option pool of 20%, 500,000 out of 2,500,000 is 20% option pool. And so they're going to use this pool to issue stock options or restricted stock units to employees and other service providers. Often, the stock plan will also include a lot of bells and whistles. related to what happens if the company sells, what happens if an employee is terminated, do they lose those shares, they repurchased, what conditions happen when they're terminated, are they terminated for cause, are they terminated for out a proper reason, what type of situation. So it's going to include a lot of different bells and whistles. Generally, the board of directors is going to carry out the stock plans. So they're going to make awards through resolutions saying, hey, we just hired someone. We approve the issuance of 10,000 shares to this individual. It's also important to note that these are securities. Stock options, restricted stock units are securities. So they're governed by state and federal law. So it's important to know what types of laws and what type of registrations you need to do and filings that you need to make when it relates to these types of securities. So let's go back to the big terms of the stock plan. What is included in the stock plan? What type of equity could someone receive? So we have restricted stock options, and restricted stock units. There's some other ones such as stock appreciation rights that we're not going to cover. So they're not really used as often as these other three. So we've talked about restricted stock in more depth in other videos. We spent a lot of time talking about vesting and the company's right of repurchase, that 4-year vesting period with the 1-year cliff. We've talked about these being generally granted to founders and early employees, the importance of an 83B election, vesting schedules, and that the recipient of restricted stock receives voting rights. So just a reminder that these restricted stocks awards can be made under the stock plan. But we're also going to talk about stock options. And though we've discussed these in very general parameters of what stock options are, there's a few different flavors of stock options. There's 2 in particular that we're going to discuss here. And just to reiterate, stock options do not grant any rights of a stockholder. It's just a contractual right to buy stock in the future at a fixed price, which is called the strike or exercise price, which must be fair market value at the time of the award. When we're talking about stock options, we need to be thinking about 3 events: when the stock option is granted, when it is exercised, when that employee or recipient pays the strike price for their stock and then holds stock, and then sale, when the stock is sold. And again, to loop back, we're going to look at the differences between 2 different types of stock options. There are NSOs, which are called non-qualified or non-statutory stock options, and there are ISOs, which are incentive stock options. Let's focus on non-statutory stock options first. So non-statutory stock options are not limited to just employees. These are available for any type of service provider. Maybe a board advisor, maybe a contractor, a board member, an officer, things like that. It's generally pretty vague on generally pretty broad on who can receive these types of stock options. Let's think about the tax consequences that happen during these 3 events: grant, exercise, and sale. So for NSOs, non-qualified stock options, at grant, there's no tax when the stock options are granted. When the stock options are exercised, there will be a tax event. The recipient will receive ordinary income, subject to ordinary income tax on the spread, which is the difference between the strike price, the exercise price, and the fair market value at the time of exercise. So let's say Carol is granted 10,000 non-qualified stock options at $1 a share. 2 days later, she exercises the NSOs when the fair market value is at $5 a share. It's a great increase. So she will owe tax on the spread of $4, $5 being the fair market value at exercise minus $1 being the strike price. So she will have tax on the ordinary income of $4 per share. Because the spread is ordinary income, the company gets a corresponding deduction. So they get to deduct the spread from their own income, which is good for the company. Now, we're also going to look at sale. Once it's exercised, the holding period for the triggering of capital gains tax is triggered. And so from 1 year, the 1 year holding period is going to be triggered for long-term capital gain upon exercise. And if it's sold 1 year later, then it'll be long-term capital gains. Let's go, and we've talked about NSOs. Let's go look at ISOs, or incentive stock options. Incentive stock options are only available for employees. It does not. One of the big differences is what happens not at grant, in which no tax obligation is triggered, like with NSOs, um, but at exercise. At exercise, this does not trigger an income tax either. However, the spread, the difference between the strike price or the exercise price and the fair market value at the time of exercise, is included in calculating the alternative minimum tax. Okay, so let's go back to the example and look at the same example, but with ISOs. Carol's granted 10,000 incentive stock options at $1 a share. 2 years later, she exercises her incentive stock options when the fair market value is at $5 per share. In this situation, unlike with the non-qualified stock options, she will not owe a tax on the spread of $4. $5 being fair market value minus $1 being the strike price. She will not owe any tax on that $4 per share. But this will have to be included in calculating AMT tax. Unlike with an NSO where the company got a deduction because of the inclusion in ordinary income, because there is no inclusion in ordinary income, the company does not get a deduction, but it also does not have to collect employment taxes on exercise. So maybe it gets rid of some of that administrative burden. That last event, sale, for sale, you will trigger the long-term capital gains in the relevant holding periods will be triggered upon exercise within 1 year the stock option is exercised and within 2 years after the stock option was granted. Then you'll get long-term capital gain tax treatment. And just to reiterate one point there, and the big distinction between ISOs that isn't tied to tax and NSOs is that ISOs are only available to employees. So these are not available to, contractors, consultants, advisors. So you need to be very clear on making sure that these are only issued to employees. All right. So one of the biggest issues with stock options and one of the biggest reasons that you need to have a stock plan in place is regarding the code section 409A. Stock options are subject to 409A. If the strike price is not fair market value at the time that the stock option is issued, then the recipient receives income equal to the spread at the time that is vested. A big thing with stock options and the difficulty in valuations is that fair market value is very difficult to determine when you're talking about a startup company or an early stage company, right? These are privately held companies. Like there's no public market. We're not selling the stock on the New York Stock Exchange. Like there's no way to determine what the fair market value is because there's not a public market for them to tell us that information. And so it's difficult to price this. And so even when the corporation has received some type of funding round in which it's received a valuation, that valuation, as we'll discuss a little bit more detail later, is based on the investor receiving preferred stock. And preferred stock comes with a lot of rights that are different and special compared to common stock. So it's not appropriate to even take that valuation price and say that that's the value of the company for the purposes of satisfying 409A and making sure that stock options are actually granted at fair market value at the time. And so why is this important? Well, if you give out stock options and they don't satisfy 409A, there's going to be a ton of tax penalties that are going to be associated with it. So it's really important to make sure that the stock options are granted at fair market value at the time they are granted. And so the IRS has a standard in determining whether or not the determined fair market value is actually correct or sufficient, right? So fair market value is satisfied if the value is based on a reasonable valuation method. So that's obviously very helpful. And obviously I'm joking. That's not helpful at all. It's pretty difficult to understand what a reasonable valuation method is. But luckily there's a few safe harbors, okay? So there's some safe harbors that if you take one of these types of approaches, you'll generally be able to say that the fair market value determination satisfies 409A. That's the independent appraisal method, which basically requires having somebody come out and actually appraise the value of the stock who is actually conducts that as a part of their business, part of their job. Their certified appraiser. The formal approach is basically setting out a mathematical or equation at the very outset to figure out what the value is, and then the startup valuation approach. Despite the name, the startup valuation approach is not actually relied upon by very many companies, nor is the formulaic version. And the startup valuation method isn't usually used because it requires a burdensome recording and thorough analysis of somebody with experience in making valuation determinations. Not many startups have someone like that on their team that has experience doing this and is able to put together a thorough analysis of their privately held stock and a justification for the valuation that they received. Instead, most venture-backed companies pay a valuation firm to come out at least once a year and to make a determination as to the fair market value of the stock. This fair market value determination is usually good for 1 year unless there's a material event that comes up, such as maybe a major fundraising round or something like that. And so it's also important to be strategic about this, like making sure that you're kind of issuing shares to employees in unison. So making sure that maybe a couple times a year or on a very periodic schedule that you're issuing shares to employees or stock options to employees, and make sure it's kind of corresponds with when you're making this fair market value determination and it's well thought out and isn't just happening sporadically. Again, those awards and those determinations made under the stock plan of awards to employees need to be evidenced in writing through board consent. So, it needs to be very strategic and very well thought out and documented before just issuing shares and coming up with a valuation. The last one that we're going to discuss here is restricted stock units. Restricted stock units are uncommon in the earliest stages of a company. They're usually used a little bit later in the life of a company, and we'll discuss that why in a minute. But restricted stock units are hypothetical units of common stock. So the awardee's not actually receiving common stock. They're just receiving hypothetical units of common stock. So they have no voting rights. They have no other incidences of ownership. And once the vesting schedule is satisfied, so once restricted stock units vest, the company settles it. So they decide once it vests whether or not they're going to give the actual shares then, the cash equivalent of the appreciation in value, or some mix. So as far as tax consequences, at the time of grant, there's not a tax. When it's settled, the spread, the difference in between the time it was granted and the fair market value at that later point in time, when it's settled, is going to be included in ordinary income. The company has a withholding obligation, which makes it a little bit more difficult for the company to handle from an administrative standpoint. And also, when it comes to restricted stock units, one of the times that you would do this is a little bit later in the life cycle of the company, when it appears like the value of the stock options are already so high that strike price isn't low. Restricted stock units kind of give them the ability to, even if there isn't a ton of appreciation, to, upon vesting or settlement, to actually receive stock as well, and then also eliminate some of the instances of being able to vote until they vest. So that's an overview a little bit on stock plans in different employee equity awards. And so I hope that was helpful. And until next time, venture awaits.